nature doesn't correspond to my nature to look beaten up. Okay, so the topic of the talk is radical right attitudes, and one of the advantages of this topic is that it doesn't need much introduction. Everybody immediately recognizes why this might be important to study. It's not a paper that tries to understand all of our current political situation. It takes a small slice of what needs to be explained, as you will see. So it's a tiny contribution, as it were, to the overall analysis of what's politically happening in many parts of the world these days. So let me jump right into it and tell you what we mean. Sorry, this is co-authored, as you can see, with colleagues from both sociology and political science. And here is a list of co-authors. And what do we mean when we try to understand radical right politics? So we look at four distinct attitudes or frames, political frames. One is populism, the idea that political elites can't be trusted, that power needs to be brought back to the people, an undifferentiated people that stands in opposition to cosmopolitan elites who have basically sold out on the people. Then ethnic nationalism is the second component, the idea that true members of the nation should have ancestors of national origin, or at least be born in the country. So ethnic and nativist kind of understandings of membership. The third component is authoritarianism, the belief that we need a strong leader to lead the country back on a virtuous path, even if these leaders violate some norms of liberal democratic institutions. And then finally, chauvinism is also a component of these radical right package, as it were, the idea that our country is morally and culturally superior to all other countries in the world. So this is not original. This is what most political scientists think are attitudes that and discourses that come together, usually bundled together. Not everybody in this literature thinks that chauvinism is part of the package, but we include it here because we think it's actually an important component of it. So the research on this is vast, mostly political science, but also in political sociology, some economics. And usually people divide two different perspectives, the supply side of radical right politics that looks at political leaders, looks at parties, the Sweden Democrats and the MAGA movement and the Finnish, what are they called? Sorry, I forgot. Modi's BJP and so on and so on. People look at discourses, analyze speeches and their effects and their resonance. They look at the role of media, echo chambers, and things like that. And then there's a vast literature on the demand side, such as it manifests itself in voting for radical right parties and in radical right attitudes. And it's on this kind of half of the or this side of the coin of radical right politics that we are focusing here on the demand side. And here you have a series of approaches, theories, you could say, they're relatively well defined. A lot of, or I would say most work looks at the economic interests, mostly of working classes, that are threatened by globalization, by immigration. They have experienced relative status decline over the last generations. Then some people look at cultural backlash against rapid, disorienting social change that produces or supports radical right attitudes. In sociology, maybe the most popular approach is status threat hypothesis, according to which recently empowered minorities threaten the dominant racial or ethnic majority, and that produces a backlash in the form of radical right attitudes. And then finally, some people, mostly in political science, think there's a general crisis of trust in political institutions, which leads to a crisis of representation, which opens the room for a radical right politics. So that's more or less the field. And we introduce a new argument. As I said before, we don't, it's a tiny, uh, well, not so tiny as we will see, but it is a contribution that doesn't seek to explain everything. And we don't think that these other theories are necessarily wrong. We just think that they don't capture the entire dynamics that's going on. And we think that milieus, in the old idea of Lebenswelten, are important, and that certain social-cultural milieus are especially conducive to radical right, to produce radical right attitudes. And we look at the multi-generational constitution of such milieus. So we don't look at social media echo chambers or things like that. We look at real life, as it were, life worlds that are constituted across generations. We also look at milieus that cut across social classes and across the rural-urban divide. So we don't replicate what some ethnographers or radical right movements have emphasized, which is that rural and working class milieus are the ones where radical right attitudes are flourishing. So in contrast to these attitudes, we seek to show that there is micro milieus that you can find in all of these different that you can find across the rural-urban divide and across the social hierarchy. And the argument is relatively simple. We think that people with deep multi-generational roots in a particular place, in a particular locale, geographic place, are more prone to develop radical right attitudes. I'm going to explain why, what are the mechanisms linking the two. This represents kind of a shadow side of multi-generational geographic stability, or rootedness, as we call it. And most of the literature in sociology, but also in political science, has emphasized the sunny side of geographic rootedness. It produces social capital in neighborhoods, which in turn reduces crime rates and other kind of symptoms of social strain. So our approach is also not a grievance approach, like most of the approaches that I briefly summarized: economic grievances of loss of income and competition with immigrants and so on, status grievances. Our approach is more about resonance. We seek to understand in which kind of milieus do radical right descriptions of the world appear morally justified and empirically plausible. So it's a kind of a resonance argument that we are pursuing here, rather than a grievance argument. And just to be clear, our argument is about how the pool of radical right supporters is filled. So a potential demand is how it comes into existence, not about how and when, through which leaders, which political conjectures, and so on, conjunctures, this pool will be mobilized. So why should intergenerational geographic stability be associated with radical right attitudes? So here's our theory, and it's kind of as I already promised you, it's kind of an analytical sociology type of theory that goes from micro through some meso mechanisms to then some macro properties. So it starts with intergenerational geographic mobility, stability, so the opposite of mobility. So we look at milieus, micro milieus, where people grow up in the places where their parents and their grandparents also were rooted. And this creates certain types of networks and orientation. And the first one is that networks are composed of many family members, obviously, and lifelong friends, people who also grew up in these stable environments. The second is that these networks, the personal networks of rooted people, are territorially more confined, they're more localized, more members of the network are actually living in the same place, and they're more densely clustered, meaning that it's more likely that friends of friends will be friends as well. So you have more triadic cluster, triadic closure. So you have these dense clusters of people who know each other as well. Third element is that individuals growing up in these micro milieus will be exposed through adulthood to parental authority or even the authority of their grandparents. Your mom and your dad show up at your house and tell you how you should educate your children and so on in such rooted milieus. Um, Yeah. And the fourth is that individuals, as a consequence of all of the above, develop a kind of a localist perspective. So the horizon of things that they consider to be relevant is confined to their local area, and they develop a pride in this local world, which is reinforced by the local pride, which is the same local pride of members of their networks. So you have a strong local and localist kind of orientation. Now, these milieu characteristics, or the characteristics of these social worlds that people inhabit, are now projected, as it were, to the national level. They are considered to be characteristics of how the nation, the country, the society as a whole looks like or should look like. And there's three mechanisms that are quite well known from the literature. One is in-group projection, so taking your own group as typical for the society, for the nation as a whole. This is social psychology terminology. Then, relatedly, we have a literature on social sampling, where people take their own characteristics and their families and so on, and their friends as average. They think they're, again, typical. And then there's a literature in nationalism studies where people have shown that people perceive national events, national um, political developments through local eyes. It's a filtering kind of effect. So how do these four milieu characteristics, through these three mechanisms, then generate radical right attitudes or lead people to find radical right discourses plausible and such that these discourses resonate with them? So if a lot of your network members are family members or lifelong friends, then the idea that that your that the nation should be that true members of the nation should be defined by ancestry and nativity becomes more plausible, resonates more. Um, the territorial confinement of networks and the dense clustering render populist descriptions of the political world more plausible, where there's a rooted people in solidarity with each other, mirroring the densely clustered networks that people experience, that is opposed to an uprooted elite from somewhere else. The exposure to parental and grandparental authority, which is universally considered to be a legitimate form of authority. That's one of the few universals across, different parts of the world. Lends authoritarian ideas credibility, the idea that we need a strong leader, a father of the nation, as it were, to make the analogy explicit. and we need to accept established social hierarchies, such as those between uh, age groups. And finally, the localist perspective and the local pride, when projected at the national level, makes chauvinism more plausible or makes chauvinist frames resonate with local people. The idea that one's own country is simply the best in the world, similar to how the town or the city where I'm currently living is perceived as the best possible place to live in the country. So that's the argument. So if you have questions to clarification, then please ask them now, and then we'll save the bigger questions maybe for later after I'm done with the talk. So the red um, boxes here correspond to things. Oh, there's a question of Mael,
Yes,
please.
thank you. This is quite interesting. I'm wondering why specifically this into adulthood. Like, why do you emphasize having this authority while being an adult?
Well, because that's the distinguishing feature of rooted people, right? People who move away from the places where their parents are and their grandparents are, obviously, when they're adults, no longer exposed to the parental and grandparental authority, while the people who stay are. So it's a different, as long as they stay in this locale. So it's a different exposure to the authority of parents and grandparents. Okay, so the red things are what we observe in, I'm going to talk about the data in a second. That's kind of it comes from our survey. So we don't have much information on these intermediary mechanisms, but I uh, did work with GSS, General Social Survey, US data, to look at some of these mechanisms. I don't have data on all of these, but some of the most important ones, that's the ones that are boxed in blue. And yes, Anders.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. I was thinking, how do you define milieu? I mean, scaling in a sense, or is it an effect of the analysis, or is it pre-analysis?
So the milieus are, as you will see when I talk about the data, are defined as micro milieus. It's kind of the or sorry, they're defined as intergenerational geographic stability. That's what we measure here in red at the very left. And this is supposed then to generate these three network structures that we observe here, or sorry, that we hypothesize here. There is a lot of literature for each. Can you see my arrow when I move this around on the
Hmm.
screen? So for each of these relationships that are hypothesized here, there is pretty good support in the literature that these are actually, empirical patterns. Um, but we don't measure these in our survey, but do measure them in parallel analysis to support the specifics of our theory with some of the GSS data that has all these network questions in there. Okay, so sorry, I have to move these pictures around all the time because otherwise I can't see what's in my screen. Let me put this here. Okay, so the hypotheses are very straightforward and not very surprising given the theoretical setup. So we think that the larger the number of ancestors born in the current town or city of an individual, that's how we measure rootedness, the more he or she should hold on to radical right attitudes. And this effect should be intergenerationally additive. So the number of grandparents and the number of parents born in a current locale should have separate effects, not just about parents. And it's not just about grandparents. They should be cumulative, as it were, because both parents and grandparents should have the same but separate effects on network composition, on local orientation, and so on and so on. And nothing in the theory that I presented to you would suggest that this mechanism should work differently across geographic communities, rural or urban divides, and across social class positions. So our argument is a kind of a micro milieu argument, and we think that you can find these rooted micromilieus both in rural and in urban environments. That's the third hypothesis. And you should find them in the more highly educated, in more affluent milieus, as well as in the less affluent and educated milieus. That's the fourth hypothesis. And this contrasts with some ethnographic work on radical right macro milieus, which invariably locate these among rural and small town environments and the working classes. Hochschild is a famous study in the US, and Kramer, there's Coquart in France, and I'm sure there must be similar work in Scandinavia that I'm not aware of. So obviously we will have to deal with reverse causation generated by selection, right? So people might move to rooted milieus where their parents and their grandparents were born because for some reason they have developed radical right attitudes already. And we will have to deal with confounders, which influence both rootedness and radical right attitudes. And we have observational data only, so we deal with these issues as well as we can. And we acknowledge that there is limitations of what you can do in terms of causal inference with observational data. I looked for natural experiments. I found this outbreak of a volcano in Iceland, and some people have studied this where people were randomly assigned to having their houses covered with lava and then had to move away. But for a variety of reasons, don't want to go into detail. This is actually not suitable for our purposes, and other data are extraordinarily hard to come by. Data, I mean, of that would correspond to some kind of a natural experiment. So we do a survey financed by the Tokyo Foundation. We ran the survey in 22 countries. Here is a list of countries. So the usual suspects, including Sweden, a lot of Western democracies that have strong radical right movements, but we also have places outside of Western Europe. We have Turkey, we have South Africa, we have Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Japan, and Korea, and India. And it's national representative samples, a total of 32 respondents. And we ask how many of the respondents' parents and grandparents were born in the town where or city where our respondents live. That's the main independent variable. It obviously ranges from 0 to 6. And then we measure our outcome variables, radical right attitudes, with 4 well-established series of questions. We don't develop anything new here, all measured with Likert scale responses. And then we do a supplementary analysis where we not only look at attitudes, but only at party preferences. So we ask, which party do you feel closest to? And then we code, and they had the choice of all the parties that are represented in the parliament at the time when we ran this survey, and then we code based on the literature, which ones are radical right parties. So here is the main results with the attitudes as the outcomes, these 4 different attitudes. And let me say something about the control variables. So we have country fixed effects, which is kind of important to deal with different party system, different reasons success of right-wing parties and so on, that we kind of fix effect away. And then we have individual level variables that are supposed to test other kinds of theories. Here is the list. So we have variables that are often used for economic threats, for cultural backlash arguments, and for status threats arguments. And this is the result. And these are 4 different models, separate models for each of the outcomes. And you can see that we have small but relatively precisely estimated effects for the number of ancestors that are born in the current town or city. Well, that's one thing, but let's look at these let's compare the effect sizes using standardized coefficients with those of other kind of variables. For ethnic nationalism, rootedness is actually the strongest predictor, only after citizenship status. I think in the next iteration of this paper, I'm going to throw non-citizens out of the sample, and so which I think is justifiable for the kind of questions that we're asking. Chauvinism, rootedness is also only surpassed by citizenship status and age. For populism and authoritarianism, the effect sizes are smaller. They're similar compared to other well-known predictors such as education and so on. So I forgot to mention for ethnic nationalism and chauvinism, so the rootedness variable has closer associations with the outcome than education, which is kind of, quite, I think, meaningful because education, as you all know, is the most powerful predictor of everything that has to do with right-wing politics. Do grandparents matter as well, or is it just parents? And here is a multi-generational analysis, a 2-generation analysis, and you can see that grandparents are as consequential. These are again standardized coefficients as parents are, and you can also see that it doesn't work that nicely for populism. In general, most of our results are a little bit more shaky for populism, and we think that this is because there's also a left-wing populist tradition in many of these countries, and people who lean towards left-wing populism there might be other causal factors involved, blurring the picture here a little bit. Now, let's see whether these associations between rootedness work across the rural-urban divides and across social class positions, as our theory implies. But before I talk about that, I just wanted to say that rooted milieus are evenly distributed. You find as many, that's for me was very surprising. You find as many people with, so let's say, 6 ancestors born in the place where they currently live in very rural places, somewhere up in the north of Sweden and in Stockholm. You find them in the Midwest, as everybody thinks, and also in New York, in highly, in places with a very high population density. And you also find rootedness to be distributed fairly evenly across socioeconomic status, measured by education and income quintiles as well. Happy to show you the tables if you're interested, but for the sake of time, let's move on and ask the question whether maybe the effects of rootedness vary across rural urban divides. Maybe there's an interaction effect, and there is no such interaction effect for rural urban divides. You can do deciles, you can dichotomize it. The results are always the same, and we do have a consistent interaction effect for social class, and surprisingly, the effects are even stronger the higher up in the social ladder you are. So one additional ancestor born in your place makes respondents even more radical right-leaning if they are educated or their income, they're in the higher income quintile. But it's still positive for more educated individuals and for those with less educated. So it's a slight tendency, happy to show you the graphs. It's not really substantially a different dynamic at all. This is the result for radical right party support as an outcome. So how close do you feel to a radical right party? And we also get significant results, but it is a much smaller effect. There's all kinds of other things that come into play here when it comes to party support, but we do have a significant effect on par with other well-known predictors of radical right party support. So let me now tell you how we try to disentangle milieu from selection effects. So it could be that individuals select into more or less rooted milieus. They move away from where their parents or grandparents are, or they come back to after college or something to where their parents and grandparents are. Due to their already formed political attitudes, could be, for example, linked to personality traits. There's some people who believe that radical right attitudes can be explained with individual level, relatively stable personality traits. Selection, however, I just want to clarify that here, cannot explain why rooted milieus should lean to the radical right. It only explains how such milieus, the political orientation of rooted milieus gets reinforced through selection. It could also be that rooted milieus are leaning to the left, and then through selection, with radical right oriented people moving away from rooted left milieus, this would then be reinforced. So selection is therefore, we have to theoretically think of it as a reinforcement mechanism, not a generative mechanism for radical right attitudes. But still, the problem of it's a problem for our inference, for our claims that everything could be driven by selection. We're stuck with observational data. And we developed three strategies of how to address this. The first is propensity score matching. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. It used to be very popular in sociology, but then I think is no longer really seen as a golden path to address kind of difficult causal inference problems. But still, we did it. So it's two steps here. You calculate the probability of individuals to live in the birthplace of their ancestors based on observables. And we have, thankfully, all the major variables that people think are, researchers think are associated with geographic mobility. And then you compare the political attitudes of pairs of individuals with similar such probabilities, but one of the respondents actually ended up in the birthplace of the ancestors while the others did not. So that's the basics of propensity score matching, and these are the results. And you can see that we find very consistent and actually encouraging results if we do this. And we define the threshold of what this is, has to be dichotomized, right? Of what it means to be rooted differently from one ancestor born in the locale, two ancestors, all six ancestors born in the locale. And as we would expect, the effects are slightly stronger the more restrictive our definition of what it means to be exposed to rooted milieus. So that's the first strategy. The second is we compare groups. We compare groups with equally likelihood of selection that they have chosen the place where they live, or we know that they have made a choice, but that they would have opposite consequences for political attitudes. So we compare root seekers, as we call them, which is individuals who, as adults, have moved to where at least three ancestors were born. So they made a choice to go to a place where they have roots. And then we compare them to root avoiders, people who have moved as adults. They also made a choice to a place where zero of their ancestors were born. Sadly, the second group is not perfectly identified because we don't know how many of these moved to a place with zero ancestors from another place with zero ancestors, which would not be, where they wouldn't select on the basis of the number of ancestors. Anders, are you having a question? You're stretching. Yeah, good idea. Um, and we would expect that root seekers should be more radical right-leaning if selection is the main mechanisms than root avoiders, right? And this is what we find. We find those who the root seekers are not actually significantly more right-leaning than the root avoiders, which speaks against the idea that selection drives the association between rootedness and political attitudes. Then we have a third strategy where we also do group comparisons. Here we look at milieu effects across groups with different likelihood of selection and similar exposure to rooted milieus. And if um, milieu effects are at work, then it should work similarly to people with different tendency of selection, right? And if selection um, is driving the association, then we should have different effects of rootedness. So we look at root seekers here, defined as before, and then we look at rooted stayers, people who have never left their birthplace and where at least one ancestor was born. This is, again, unfortunately, not perfect because there might be people who actually would like to move away um, because maybe they don't like the milieu, but they're stuck. They're not able to actually get out of their place. So ideally we would have um, not have these people in this group for the purposes of this comparison, right? No, sorry, it's the opposite. I messed it up. Ideally, we would have only those who are stuck in place, um, not those who self-selected into never moved away from the places where their ancestors were born as well. So if selection drives attitudes, root seekers again should be more right-leaning than rooted stayers. Obviously. And if milieu effects drives the attitudes, then, or the association, then the effects of additional ancestors should be identical for root seekers and for rooted stayers. Then you would be, this would indicate that we have a homogeneous um, milieu effect across groups with different tendency of self-selection. And that's exactly what we find. Here you can see that root seekers and rooted stayers don't differ from each other in their political attitude, which kind of again speaks against selection effects. And you can see that rootedness, that's the interaction effect, has similar consequences for there's no interaction effect between rooted stayers and or root seekers and the number of ancestors born in a locale, which again speaks for the possibility that you have uniform milieu effects across these groups with different tendency for selection. Okay, so let me talk about some, unless there's a question, doesn't seem to be the case. Let me talk about some confounders and just very briefly report that our results also hold if we control for local economic decline, which or a crisis, which could get people stuck in the place where they are and make them more radical right at the same time. So here I use US data with county unemployment rates. I'm sure I could do the same for Sweden. I could do the same for Germany, and so on and so on. maybe I should actually go beyond just the easy thing and use US data. Traditionalism is another confounder. It could encourage people to stick with their family. That's a traditional value. And it could make them lean more radical right. And we have an item in our survey that measures the fear to lose traditions, so how important traditions are for people, and everything stays the same. Our coefficients for the rootedness variable doesn't move at all if we include this additional variable. Then we also look at downward social mobility, since we have data for the education of parents as well as grandparents, and we have data for occupational prestige of parents and grandparents, and none of these measurements of mobility that we create on that basis are doing anything here. Okay, so how am I doing time-wise? Pretty good, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me contextualize this argument a little bit again before I conclude. So does this argument explain the recent rise of the radical right parties in many, many places around the world? The AfD, I don't know exactly how the Sweden Democrats are doing these days, but I think they are still haven't reached their peak of popularity either, have they? Yeah. and and so on and so on. Well, obviously not. We don't have data over time. We only have a snapshot, so we can't really offer a dynamic analysis. But I would like to uh, offer you some conjectures that our kind of argument could also contribute to understanding the recent rise of radical right support. And in many countries, that's the first conjecture, intergenerational geographic mobility has decreased substantially over time, uh, over the last couple of decades. So, which would make you, if our theory is anything worth, would make you expect that you have more demand for radical right parties. And this is data again from the US. This is since 1950s, and just look at the dark line. That's the percentage of people who have lived in a different county a year ago, and you see a quite dramatic decrease. It starts in the 80s from now I can't see, let me move the pictures again, from about 20% of people who had been mobile during the last period to about 7.5%. So that's quite a dramatic decrease. I'm sure you would find similar. I know from a literature in geographic mobility, in geography actually, that you have similar developments in the UK, and I think in some other Western countries where people have studied this as well. So that was the first conjecture. The second one zooms out even more temporally and looks at macro political developments over the last 200 years. And it's, again, just a conjecture. So over this period, you have a massive decrease in rootedness during industrialization and urbanization, where masses of people were uprooted and moved to the cities. And this coincides again with the massive expansion of non-radical right, liberal kind of political ideas, with liberal understandings of the nation, with non-populist forms of policy making, with democratic, institutionalist attitudes, and so on and so on. So that's just a conjecture to kind of make this theory, although it is not actually designed to be more dynamic and to actually maybe have it talk to recent developments a little bit as well. So the conclusion is straightforward. So we introduced this new argument of multi-generational milieus And we do find that intergenerational geographic stability is a very strong predictor, stronger than education, for all of these four outcomes of radical right party attitudes. And it's also associated with party preferences, although there the results are much less strong. And this is largely overlooked in the literature. It's merely hinted at that geographic stability plays a role in some ethnographic studies, for example, on the role of rural consciousness and local sense of solidarity and so on, but it's never really fleshed out and never giving its own kind of, it's never really in the center of the analysis. We have some suggestive evidence, not conclusive, that these are indeed milieu effects and not mostly selection. So I like to believe that at least part of what we're seeing here is indeed of a causal nature. And uh, contrary to a common perception among social scientists and progressive people more generally, rootedness is not the exclusive domain of rural and educated environments. So I think that's an important specification of how we think this milieu argument works. So in New York, where I live, I don't know whether you guys are familiar with New York, but there is Staten Island, which is an island close to Manhattan, where if you go there, there is a massively rooted, in this case, working class family milieu, and it is a deep red little pocket of radical, of MAGA kind of republicanism in the middle of the city of New York. If you go to Newport Beach in Orange County on the other side of the coast. Sorry to bother you with American examples, but I just don't have, probably I should have asked ChatGPT to give me equivalent Swedish examples. If you go to the other side of the coast to Orange County, which is part of Greater LA, you have Newport Beach, which is an affluent community, mostly gated communities, with a lot of multi-generational arrangements there. And it is also a deeply red pocket in an otherwise very blue state. We also go beyond the usual focus on the West. We show that it works actually in a whole range of countries. I didn't have time to do that here. Happy to talk a little bit about where it works, where it doesn't work, and so on, and what could possibly explanations be. But overall, we don't have a single country where we would have a coefficient that would go against our expectations. They're not always significant, but none of them contradicts our arguments. So I think it would be interesting if future research could broaden this research agenda. We don't think that this is the only milieu within which radical right attitude flourish. There's obviously tech bros, which tend to be quite radical, often even anti-democratic, right? The golf course, obviously, but also recent immigrants who embrace radical right views to claim full membership. My taxi driver, I'm now in Switzerland and I came from New York. My taxi driver yesterday is a Bengali refugee who became naturalized. His whole family and clan became naturalized a while ago, and they all voted for Trump. It's kind of fascinating. So I think a broader milieu theoretic approach to understanding radical right attitudes and voting behavior and so on could be quite promising. And I'll stop here. Shall I get out of the PowerPoint, perhaps?
Yeah, if you want. Thank you very much, Andreas. I will stop the recording